My name is Lena Whitaker, and the morning after I turned 18, my father tried to take my life apart with a blue pen and a smile. It was a Saturday in October, the kind of cold Ohio morning, where the windows fogged at the edges, and the kitchen smelled like burnt coffee, because my mother always left the pot sitting too long. I came downstairs in an old sweatshirt, still half asleep, expecting leftover birthday cake, or maybe the usual quiet disappointment that followed every family celebration once the guests were gone. Instead, my father was waiting at the kitchen table. Raymond Whitaker had already dressed for work, even though his office was closed on weekends. White shirt, navy tie, gold watch. The costume of a man who wanted the room to believe he was in control. Beside him sat my mother, Maribel, with both hands folded around her mug, watching me with that soft, worried face she used whenever she was about to do something cruel and call it love. A stack of papers lay between them. My father tapped the top page once. "Just sign it, Lena," he said. "Let the adults handle the trust before you hurt yourself with it." I looked at the pen first, then at the papers, then at him. For most of my childhood, that would have been enough to make me shrink. His voice had a way of turning ordinary rooms into courtrooms where I was always the defendant. But that morning, something in me stayed still. I did not reach for the pen. I asked, "Adults?" My mother's mouth tightened. I looked back at my father and said, "Or do you mean the parents who filed to have me declared unfit before breakfast?" The kitchen went silent. For the first time in my life, my father looked surprised by me. What he did not know was that, at 12:06 that morning, every dollar of my grandparents' $3.4 million trust had already been moved beyond his reach. To understand why I knew not to touch that pen, you have to understand the room where I first learned what honesty looked like. It was not in my parents' house. It was in my grandmother June Merrick's sewing room, built onto the back of her brick ranch like an afterthought, though to me it always felt like the center of the whole place. The room had 3 tall windows, a scarred wooden cutting table, 2 dress forms with linen covers, and shelves filled with fabric stacked by color. Ivory satin, blue cotton, gray wool. Cream lace folded so carefully it looked like it was waiting for someone's better day. Grandma June made wedding dresses, church dresses, funeral dresses, prom hems, baptism gowns, whatever the town brought her. Women came in nervous, hopeful, self-conscious about the fit, worried about money, worried about mothers-in-law, worried about being seen too much or not seen at all. Grandma June never rushed them. She would kneel with pins between her lips, lift a hem, smooth a seam, and say, "Stand natural, honey. Clothes should fit the person, not the lie they're trying to survive." I was 8 the first time she let me sit under the cutting table while she worked. By 12, I knew how to thread her old Singer machine, how to press a seam flat without burning the fabric, and how to tell cheap polyester from real silk with my fingertips. She taught me patience through small, ordinary things. Measure twice, cut once, never pull a loose thread, just because it bothers you. Find where it begins first. My mother hated that room. She said it smelled like steam, dust, and other people's problems. She said Grandma June filled my head with small-town thinking, as if kindness were a lack of ambition. But I think what bothered my mother most was that Grandma never treated me like something to manage. In that room, my questions did not make people sigh. They made Grandma reach for another spool, another scrap of fabric, another story. One afternoon, I watched her rip open the side seam of a nearly finished dress. I gasped because from the outside, it looked perfect. Grandma smiled without looking up. "A seam only holds if both sides are honest," she said. "Pretty stitching won't save crooked cloth." I thought she was talking about fabric. Years later, standing in my parents' kitchen with legal papers on the table and my mother's gentle face hiding something sharp, I understood her completely. My family had always looked pressed and proper from the outside. But underneath, every seam had been pulled crooked for years. My grandmother taught me to look at the underside of things. My grandfather taught me to look at the bottom of the page. Walter Merrick's print shop sat on the corner of a narrow street downtown, wedged between a barber shop and a pharmacy that still had a bell over the door. The front window had faded gold lettering that said, Merrick Printing and Forms, and when you walked inside, the air smelled like ink, paper dust, machine oil, and coffee that had been reheated too many times. Most children would have found it boring. I loved it there. Grandpa Walter printed everything the town did not think twice about until it mattered. Lease agreements, tax forms, bank notices, funeral programs, church bulletins, business cards for contractors, dentists, mortgage men, and church board members who all wanted their names centered and embossed. He knew the weight of paper by touch. He could tell when a contract had been copied too many times. He could spot a missing clause the way other men spotted rain clouds. When I was 13, he started letting me sit beside him at the long counter after school. He would slide a form in front of me and ask, "What do you see first?" I would point to the bold title. He would shake his head. "That is what they want you to see first. Try again." So I learned to read differently. Not fast. Not politely. I learned to read like someone had hidden a trap and expected me to be too embarrassed to look for it. Grandpa showed me where late fees lived, where consent hid, where authority transferred from one person to another in language so dry it almost put you to sleep. One afternoon, he handed me a sample power of attorney form from an old legal order and tapped the middle paragraph with his finger. "Never fear the signature line," he said. "Fear the paragraph above it." I laughed because I thought he was being dramatic. He did not laugh back. That was when my father walked in. Raymond Whitaker filled the doorway in his work coat, his jaw already tight. He looked at the papers, then at me, then at Grandpa. "She's 13, Walter," he said. "She doesn't need to know this." Grandpa folded the form once, very slowly. "She will," he said, "if someone she loves ever hands her a pen with a smile." For a moment, nobody moved. Even the old press in the back seemed quieter. My father gave a thin laugh and said Grandpa always confused caution with paranoia. Then he told me to get my backpack. I obeyed. I was still young enough to obey. But I looked back before we left, and Grandpa was watching my father, not me. That was the first time I understood that warnings do not always sound like fear. Sometimes they sound like preparation. Please subscribe to support the channel. I bet you're watching this video right now while lying down with your legs crossed, right? If that's true, type 3. If not, type 4. Let's see whether I got it right. Alright, enough talking. Let's begin the story. For years after that afternoon at the print shop, I told myself my father had only been embarrassed, that he did not like being corrected by his father-in-law in front of his daughter. That maybe every family had rooms where the air changed for reasons children were not supposed to understand. But the older I got, the harder it became to pretend I was imagining things. In our house, my younger sister Tessa was the easy child. That was the word my mother used most. Easy. She said it like a compliment, like a virtue. Like a girl's highest achievement was to move through a room without disturbing anyone's version of peace. Tessa was polished by the time she was 14, all shiny ponytails and white sneakers, captain of the cheer squad, honor roll most semesters, even when she barely seemed to study, the kind of daughter people congratulated my parents for raising. At school events, my mother stood with other parents and spoke about Tessa like she was reading from a brochure. Disciplined, social, resilient, a natural leader. My father took pictures of her with trophies, flowers, restaurant desserts with candles stuck in them, anything that could be posted or framed or shown to clients who came by his mortgage office. I was not difficult at first. I was curious. There is a difference, but in my family, nobody was interested in learning it. I asked why my father called certain debts temporary when the envelope stayed unopened on the counter for months. I asked why he spoke softly when business calls came in after dinner. I asked why my mother smiled at women from church and then criticized them before their cars reached the end of the driveway. I asked why the version of our family we performed in public never seemed to match the one we lived inside. That was when the labels started. At first, my mother would touch my shoulder and say, "Lena has always been sensitive." Then sensitive became anxious. Anxious became dramatic. By 16, if I disagreed with anything, Even quietly, my father would sigh and say, "This is what we mean, Lena. You spiral." I did not know how dangerous a family label could be until much later. Back then, I only knew it made people stop listening before I finished a sentence. It turned every question into a symptom, and every silence into proof that something was wrong with me. Tessa learned the rules faster than I did. Smile. Nod. Let Dad explain. Let Mom translate cruelty into concern. And never, ever ask where the money went. I kept asking. That was why they needed me to become unstable before the trust became mine. Before they could convince a judge I was unstable, they first had to get my name on the right piece of paper. It happened the spring after Grandma June died. I was 17, finishing junior year, walking around with the strange numbness that comes when grief does not arrive all at once but waits for quiet moments to open the door. I would be brushing my teeth and remember the sound of her scissors closing through fabric. I would be sitting in class and suddenly smell steam from her iron. Then I would come home to my parents' house, where nobody said her name unless they needed to explain why I looked tired. One Thursday evening, my mother called me into the dining room. Not the kitchen. That should have warned me. The dining room was where we put company, holiday candles, and conversations my parents wanted to feel official. My father sat at the head of the table with a folder in front of him. My mother stood behind the chair beside mine, one hand resting on its back like she was presenting it to me. Her voice was gentle in that polished way that made other people trust her. "Sweetheart," she said, "we need to get some adult paperwork handled before your birthday. Insurance, emergency contacts, bank contact updates, college planning releases. Boring things. We just don't want anything to fall through the cracks." I looked at the folder. It had colored tabs along the edge, little arrows showing where to sign. My father smiled. "Nothing complicated. Your mother and I are just making sure you're covered." There are moments that embarrass me to remember, not because I did something wrong, but because I can still feel how badly I wanted them to be good. I wanted that folder to mean they were helping. I wanted my mother's hand on my shoulder to be comfort, not pressure. I wanted to be the kind of daughter who could sign a few forms without turning the room into another argument. So I sat down. My mother squeezed my shoulder. "You've had such a hard year, Lena. Let us carry a little of this." That was the sentence that did it. Not because it was kind, but because I needed kindness so much that I mistook the shape of it for the real thing. I signed where the arrows told me to sign. Health insurance consent, emergency medical authorization, bank contact update, college planning release. Page after page of harmless-looking language, each one placed like a layer of fabric over the one piece they truly wanted hidden. Near the back was a document labeled as a financial authorization. Later, Monica would tell me what it really was. A durable financial power of attorney, prepared to take effect the morning I turned 18, with my father's name already typed into the authority line. I did not read it. I capped the pen, thanked them, and went upstairs feeling ashamed of how relieved I was. That was the cruelest part. They did not steal my signature from a careless girl. They took it from a grieving one. I did not know what I had signed until the phone call came in July, 3 months before my 18th birthday. The number was unfamiliar, and normally I would have let it go to voicemail, but something about the Dayton area code made me answer. A woman asked for me by my full name, Lena Whitaker, in a voice so even it made me sit up straighter. "My name is Edith Calder," she said. "I served as trustee for Walter and June Merrick. Your grandparents left instructions for me to contact you before your birthday." I remember looking toward my bedroom door, half expecting my mother to appear in the hallway. Nobody in my parents' house used the word trustee. Nobody said my grandparents' names unless they had to. I lowered my voice and asked what it was about. "Not over the phone," Edith said. "Come to my office, alone." Her office was on the 3rd floor of an old limestone building downtown, the kind with brass mail slots in the lobby and elevators that moved like they were thinking it over. Edith Calder was 64, silver-haired, narrow-framed, and dressed in a charcoal suit that looked older than me, but better maintained than most people. She did not smile when I walked in, but she did stand. On her desk was a red folder with my name on the tab. "Your grandparents created a trust when you were 12, she said, opening it. "They amended it twice before your grandmother passed. You are the sole beneficiary." I sat very still. She turned the first page toward me. "As of last quarter, the trust holds approximately $3.4 million. For a second, the room made no sound. Edith continued like she had just told me the weather. "A managed investment portfolio worth about $1.65 million. The brick ranch house, appraised at $420,000. A duplex on Del Mar Avenue valued around $610,000. Municipal bonds, just over $720,000. Income, insurance, maintenance instructions, everything listed, dated, signed." My hands stayed in my lap because I did not trust them on the desk. "They left this to me?" I asked. "They left it for you," Edith corrected. "There is a difference. Walter was particular about language." That sounded so much like him that my throat tightened. Then Edith closed the folder halfway and looked at me over the top of her glasses. "Lena, your father has contacted my office 4 times since April. Your uncle called twice. They asked about distribution dates, management rights, and whether a parent could be appointed to assist an 18-year-old beneficiary." The room stopped feeling cold and started feeling sharp. Then she asked the question that changed everything. "Did your father make you sign anything this year?" I must have gone pale, because Edith did not ask the question again. She simply slid a legal pad across the desk and handed me a pen, not to sign anything, but to write down every document I remembered from that night in the dining room. Insurance consent, emergency authorization, bank contact update, college planning release. Then I stopped. "There was one near the back," I said. It said financial authorization. Edith's face did not change, but her fingers tightened slightly around her glasses. Within 48 hours, she had me in a conference room with Monica Vale, a litigation attorney who specialized in probate abuse and guardianship fraud. Monica was 41, sharp-eyed, with short dark hair, and the kind of calm that did not comfort you so much as make you believe the floor would hold. She read the copied pages my parents had given me, then read them again, slower. "This isn't a permission slip," she said. I already knew that from her tone. "It's a durable financial power of attorney, prepared to become effective when you turn 18. Broad authority, banking, investments, real property, transfers, account access. Your father's name is typed into every authority line." My stomach turned, but the strange thing was that I did not cry. Something in me had moved past shock and into recognition. Monica looked up. "If this becomes active before we revoke it, he can attempt to move assets in your name." "Why would he need to?" I asked, even though some part of me already knew the answer would not be about helping me. That was when Edith made another call. Her name was Kendra Pike. She had been the escrow manager at Whitaker Home Lending until 3 months earlier. When she resigned so abruptly, my father told everyone she was burned out and bitter. Kendra agreed to meet us in a quiet booth at a diner outside Dayton, the kind of place with cracked vinyl seats and coffee that tasted like metal. She arrived with a canvas bag full of printed emails. "I don't want revenge," she said before she sat down. "I just don't want him doing this to somebody else." Monica did not interrupt her. Kendra laid out the truth carefully. My father had been using customer escrow funds to keep a failed Lake Erie condo project alive. Transfers marked temporary, reimbursements delayed, accounts patched just enough to pass casual review. By Kendra's estimate, the whole was around $780,000. I stared at the number on the page. 78,000,000. Not a mistake, not bad luck, not a misunderstanding. Ahole. And my trust was the dirt he planned to shovel into it. For years, my father had called me sensitive for noticing cracks, dramatic for asking questions, unstable for refusing to look away. But sitting in that diner, with his former employees' emails spread between the salt shaker and the sugar packets, I finally understood something colder. He was not afraid I would mishandle my inheritance. He was afraid I would read him correctly. Once I knew what my father needed the money for, every conversation in our house started sounding different. He no longer argued with me directly. That would have been too honest. Instead, he began speaking in little careful phrases, the kind that could be repeated later without sounding cruel. If I asked why he was home late, he would glance at my mother and say, "Lena gets fixated on things." If I stayed quiet through dinner, he would sigh and say, "See? She shuts down when she's overwhelmed." If I disagreed with him, even calmly, he called it a reaction. Not anger. Not intelligence. Not fear. A reaction. My mother worked with softer tools. Maribel Whitaker had spent years making people believe she was the kind of woman who held a family together by sheer grace. At Street Catherine's, she organized fundraisers, arranged donation baskets, remembered birthdays, and knew exactly when to lower her voice, so concern sounded like virtue. She started using that voice on me in public. At church, she would touch my arm and say, "Lena's having a hard season. We're giving her extra support." At school events, she would tell other mothers, "She's brilliant, but fragile." Fragile was new. I heard it first near the folding tables after Sunday service, while Father Malcolm Reed stood beside the coffee urn. My mother said it with her hand pressed lightly to her chest, as if my condition pained her more than it pained me. Father Malcolm looked over at me with kind eyes, and for one painful second, I understood how well her performance worked. He did not see a mother building a case. He saw a mother worried about her daughter. That was the genius of it. They did not have to prove I was incapable yet. They only had to make the idea feel familiar. Tessa absorbed it fastest. She was 16, still young enough to believe that the safest place in the family was beside the people with the loudest certainty. My mother told her I was changing. My father told her money could ruin a person. By the end of August, Tessa looked at me like I was something unpredictable, left too close to a flame. One night, I heard her through the bedroom wall. "Is Lena going to take everything?" she asked. My mother answered softly, "We're trying not to let that happen." Not, "That money is Lena's." Not, "Your sister is scared." Just, "We're trying." That was how they did it. They turned theft into protection, control into sacrifice, and my refusal to be robbed into proof that I was dangerous. I stood in the hallway, barefoot on the carpet, and did not correct them. Monica had told me to let them build their story. So I listened. And I remembered every word. The night before my 18th birthday, I went back to Grandma June's sewing room because it was the only place where silence had ever felt safe. The brick ranch had been empty since her funeral, but Edith had given me a key after our first meeting, telling me my grandparents had wanted me to have access before the trust distributed. I drove there after dinner with my laptop bag on the passenger seat and Monica's instructions folded inside my notebook. The house was dark when I arrived. The porch light flickered once before staying on, and for a second I stood there like a child waiting for someone to open the door. No one did. Inside, the air was cool and still. The hallway smelled faintly of cedar, dust, and the lavender sachets Grandma used to tuck into drawers. I did not turn on the overhead lights. I walked straight to the sewing room and switched on the small brass lamp from Grandpa Walter's desk, the one Edith had found wrapped in newspaper in the front closet. The room came alive in a circle of yellow light. The cutting table was bare now, except for my laptop, a black pen, and the stack of documents Monica had prepared. Revocation of power of attorney. Consent to continued trust protection. Direction to trustee. Notice to financial institutions. Each page had been explained to me twice. Each paragraph had been read all the way through. I could hear Grandpa's voice as clearly as if he were standing behind me. Fear the paragraph above it. At 11:42 p.m., Monica joined the video call. Edith appeared a minute later from her office, wearing reading glasses and the same charcoal suit jacket she seemed to use as armor. Neither of them made small talk. I appreciated that. "You understand what happens at midnight," Monica said. I nodded. "If we wait until morning, your father may try to act first. If we move now, the authority he thinks he has never gets a clean opening." Edith added, Your grandparents built this option into the trust for exactly this kind of situation. Exactly this kind of situation. The words should have comforted me. Instead, they made me sad in a way I was not prepared for. Walter and June had loved me enough to protect me from their own daughter's husband. Maybe even from their own daughter. They had seen the crooked seam long before I had the language for it. At 12:01 a.m., I signed. My hand shook once, but only once. Monica countersent the revocation. Edith executed the trust direction. At 12:06, notices went to the bank, the investment custodian, and the property manager holding the Delmare duplex accounts. Then Monica looked into the camera and said, "It's locked, Lena." I sat back in Grandma June's chair and let the words settle. Across town, my father was probably asleep beside his plan, believing it would still wake up in the morning. It would not. By noon, my mother had turned the house into a celebration. There were white tulips in vases, a lemon cake from the bakery on Far Hills, folded napkins, coffee urns, and a banner across the living room that said, "Happy 18th, Lena," in gold letters. If someone had walked in without knowing my family, they would have thought it was sweet. A mother making an effort. A father proud of his daughter. A house full of relatives gathered to mark the beginning of adulthood. But I had seen the papers on the kitchen table that morning. I had seen my father's face when I asked about the petition. I had watched him recover, smooth his tie, and say we would discuss this like a family once everyone arrived. That was when I understood the brunch was not a party. It was a witness stand with pastries. Aunt Helen stood near the fireplace, watching my mother move through the room with a tray of coffee cups. Father Malcolm Reed came in wearing his black coat, kind and uncomfortable, as if he had been invited into something he could not name. Tessa stayed close to my mother, pale around the mouth, avoiding my eyes. My father kept checking his phone every few minutes, turning slightly away each time the screen lit and then went dark. I knew what he was waiting for. A confirmation that would never come. I stood near the hallway with a glass of water and let them fill the room. Let them smile, let them say how grown-up I looked. Let my mother touch my back and tell people I had been having a hard season, but we were all hopeful. Then my father tapped a spoon against his coffee cup. The room quieted. "I just want to thank everyone for coming," he said, warm and steady. Walter and June left this family with a tremendous responsibility. And as a family, we've decided that I'll manage Lena's trust until she's emotionally ready to handle it herself. There it was. As a family, we've decided. I set my glass down on the side table. "I never decided that," I said. Every face turned toward me. My father gave me the patient look he used with clients. "Lena, sweetheart, this is exactly what we talked about. You're overwhelmed." "No," I said. "You talked. I listened." My mother stepped in quickly, one hand rising to her chest. "This is what we've been worried about. She thinks everyone is against her." I looked at Father Malcolm first, then Aunt Helen, then Tessa. "My parents filed paperwork to have me declared unfit," I said. "They hid a financial power of attorney in forms I signed while grieving my grandmother, and my father needs $780,000 before his escrow problem becomes public." The room did not gasp. It went quieter than that. My father's phone buzzed in his hand. For once, nobody looked at me like I was unstable. They looked at him. 8 days later, the room where my parents tried to finish what they started was smaller than I expected. Probate court did not look like the kind of place where families broke open. It had beige walls, fluorescent lights, rows of wooden benches, and a clock that clicked too loudly above the judge's chair. My father sat at one table with my mother beside him, both dressed carefully enough to look wounded but respectable. Raymond wore a gray suit. Maribel wore navy and pearls, her church version of sorrow. Curtis Vance sat with them, flipping through papers as if confidence could be arranged by page number. I sat at the other table with Monica Vale. She had told me not to look for fairness in anyone's face before the hearing started. "Let the record do the work," she said. So I kept my hands folded and looked straight ahead, while my parents' attorney described me as anxious, volatile, emotionally fragile, too young to understand the responsibility of a multi-million-dollar trust. He said I had become paranoid after my grandparents' deaths. He said my parents were acting out of concern. He said the court needed to protect me from myself. Monica let him finish. That was the part I remember most. She did not interrupt. She did not roll her eyes. She let every word land, because the more they said, the more obvious it became that they had brought adjectives instead of evidence. When she stood, her voice was calm enough to make the room lean in. Your Honor, there is no medical diagnosis, no doctor's letter, no treatment record, no school report showing incapacity, no documented inability to manage basic affairs. What the petitioners have presented is a family narrative, not legal proof. Judge Arthur Bellamy looked over his glasses at Curtis. Counsel, where is the evidence of incapacity? Curtis shuffled his papers. My mother's fingers tightened around a tissue. Then Monica laid out the timeline. The financial authorization hidden inside routine forms, the power of attorney prepared to activate on my 18th birthday. The revocation sent at 12:06 a.m. The trust direction executed before Raymond could touch the accounts. The calls my father made to Edith's office. The petition filed only after the money was locked beyond his reach. Then came Kendra Pike. She sat 2 rows back, hands clasped around a folder. Monica did not need her to speak long. The emails were enough. Escrow transfers, delayed reimbursements, a failed Lake Erie condo project bleeding money. A shortage of approximately $780,000. For the first time all morning, my father looked less angry than exposed. Judge Bellamy read in silence for nearly a full minute. Then he set the papers down. This is not protection, he said. This is a takeover dressed in parental concern. My mother made a small sound. The judge denied the petition on the spot and referred the matter for further review. I did not smile. I only breathed. Because for once, the room had heard the version of me that was true. The fallout did not arrive like thunder. It came in envelopes, phone calls, quiet rooms, and people who suddenly stopped knowing what to say. Within weeks, Raymond Whitaker's mortgage office was under review. Kendra's emails opened doors he had spent years pretending were walls. The escrow shortage became more than a rumor, and the Lake Erie condo project, the one he had tried to keep breathing with other people's money, collapsed into paperwork he could not charm his way out of. Clients called. Regulators called. Attorneys called. The gold letters on his office door came down before winter. My mother's fall was quieter, which probably hurt her more. Maribel had built her whole life on being admired in soft lighting, in church basements, at school fundraisers, beside donation baskets with her hand over her heart. After the hearing, people did not attack her. They did something worse. They stepped back. Father Malcolm called me 2 days later. His voice sounded older than it had at my birthday brunch. He said he was sorry for allowing himself to be used as scenery in a story he had not questioned closely enough. I told him I appreciated the call. I did not tell him it fixed anything, because it did not. But it mattered that one adult finally admitted the truth without asking me to make it easier for him. Tessa found me outside the courthouse that day, after my parents left through a side door with Curtis Vance whispering behind them. She stood near the stone steps, arms wrapped around herself, looking younger than 16. They told me you were breaking the family, she said. I waited. Her eyes filled, but she did not cry. They never said they were trying to buy it with your money. That was not an apology. Not yet. But it was the first honest sentence she had given me in years, so I kept it. I went back to Grandma June's sewing room that evening. The house was mine to live in through the trust, but it did not feel like mine yet. It felt like a place waiting to see whether I would finally stop asking permission to stand inside it. In the bottom drawer of the cutting table, I found a small envelope with my name written in Grandma's hand. Inside was 1 page. Do not spend your life stitching yourself smaller so other people can wear the truth comfortably. I read it 3 times. Years later, I became a forensic accountant. I learned to follow signatures, missing balances, quiet transfers, and the kind of family lies people hide inside official language. I do not call it revenge. I call it literacy. I did not win against my family. No one wins when the people who were supposed to protect you become the reason you need protection. But I kept my name. I kept my grandparents' trust. And I kept the right to never again be sewn into a version of myself that made someone else's life fit better. The lesson Lena's story leaves behind is not really about money. The trust mattered, of course. The court mattered. The papers mattered. But underneath all of that was something quieter and far more painful. The moment a person realizes that love and control can sometimes wear the same face. Family is supposed to be the place where your name is safe, where people know your fears and do not use them as evidence against you, where grief is held gently, not searched for a signature. But some families do not protect the vulnerable parts of you. They study them, they learn where you are soft, where you are tired, where you still want to be loved, and then they call their control concern. That is why Lena's strength was not loud. She did not win by screaming, humiliating, or becoming cruel like the people who hurt her. She won by staying steady, by reading carefully, by listening to the people who had truly loved her, by understanding that being called difficult does not mean you are wrong. Sometimes, difficult is just the word controlling people use when you stop being easy to manage. There is a deep kind of courage in refusing to shrink. Not everyone will understand it. Some people will say you changed. Some will say you are ungrateful. Some will say, you are tearing the family apart, when all you did was stop holding together a lie that was cutting you open. Lena did not walk away with a perfect ending. She walked away with boundaries. And sometimes, that is the most honest ending life gives us. Healing does not always look like a reunion. Sometimes it looks like a quiet room, a signed document, a door you can close, and the first full breath you have taken in years. So if this story reminded you of someone in your own life, or of a time when you had to protect yourself from people who claimed they loved you, tell me in the comments, what would you have done in Lena's place? If this story moved you, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear this today. Your voice in the comments may help someone else feel less alone.